I keep records for a living. That is the whole of my professional identity. I am the person who writes things down, files them in the correct sequence, and retrieves them when the people who made the decisions would prefer to have forgotten them. I work for the Interstellar Mediation Compact, which is a body that sounds more impressive than it is. We are, in practice, 12 people in 3 offices, a small budget, a large filing system, and a mandate that nobody takes seriously until they desperately need us. I have been asked, more than once, why I stay. The answer is, someone has to hold the originals. I have held this position for 19 years. In that time, I have witnessed 14 treaty negotiations, 4 border arbitrations, 1 full Galactic Council intervention, and the single, most quietly devastating administrative morning I have ever experienced took place aboard the Keth Dominion's primary diplomatic station, and which I will now describe in full, because it deserves a record, and because nobody else who was present seems inclined to write it up. My name is Carver. That is sufficient. The station was called Veth Arador, which translates from Keth into something approximating the crown of governance, though our translator noted that crown in Keth carries a secondary meaning closer to the part that is too heavy to wear comfortably, struck me at the time as either very honest or very unlucky branding. It hung in geostationary orbit above the Keth homeworld, and it was genuinely impressive. Layered rings of dark composite plating, amber running lights in geometric rows, docking bays large enough to cradle destroyer-class vessels without the berth attendants having to squeeze. The Keth build big. They are a large species, heavily armored in their natural state. Broad thoracic plating, articulated limb segments, calmed eyes that catch light in a way that makes you feel observed from 11 angles simultaneously. They move with the unhurried deliberateness of something that has never needed to be afraid. Their architecture reflects this. Everything is scaled to remind you that you are smaller than the room. I arrived aboard the IMC Courier vessel Portsmouth 7, 3 days before the scheduled arbitration session. The Portsmouth 7 is, I will concede, not a beautiful ship. It is approximately 40 years old, built in the Lachlan yards during a period when the Compact was operating on a procurement budget that can only be described as aspirational. It is 112 meters long, which is not small, but which is the kind of not small that goes unnoticed when docked beside Keth vessels, that measure in kilometers. Its hull has been patched in at least 4 places with materials that do not quite match the original plating, giving it the coloration of a document that has been corrected with the wrong pen. It has 2 functioning point defense arrays, one of which occasionally needs a firm tap on a specific panel near the port coupling before it will acknowledge a targeting query. Its identifying markings are clear, its registration current, its crew of 6 competent and unbothered. It does not look like a ship that matters. This was, in retrospect, the single most consequential feature it possessed. The Keth Docking Authority assigned us berth 91 Omicron, which I later learned was the station's designated overflow bay, for vessels that did not merit a standard berth but could not be turned away without a diplomatic incident. It was located at the outermost ring of the station, beside a supply depot, and across from what appeared to be a maintenance staging area. There was no berth attendant waiting. The docking clamps were manual. The corridor from berth 91 Omicron to the interior transit system was long, poorly lit by Keth standards, and smelled of coolant, and something I did not identify but which our navigator says was probably Keth hydraulic fluid, which would make sense given the maintenance staging area. I noted all of this without particular feeling. I have been assigned worse berths. The Keth delegation's administrative liaison met us at the transit terminal. His name, transliterated, was something like Vethris Call, though he introduced himself with a diminutive that I understood to be the Keth equivalent of a professional title indicating mid-tier administrative, rank with aspirations. He was polite in the clipped, efficient way of someone who has been told to be polite and is executing the instruction correctly without additional embellishment. He conducted us through the transit system to the temporary quarters allocated for the Compact's delegation, which were functional and well-appointed in the cool, impersonal style of Keth institutional interiors. Composite walls, amber-lit alcoves, furniture scaled for being somewhat larger than a human, but adjusted, reasonably thoughtfully, with supplementary items. He asked if our vessel had experienced any difficulties during transit. I said no. He asked if our crew required any technical support with our— He paused here for approximately half a second, docking interface. I said no. He then expressed, on behalf of the Keth Dominion Diplomatic Affairs Directorate, their appreciation for the Compact's participation in the forthcoming session, and he handed me a schedule printed on Keth paper, which is a heavy material that feels like pressed ceramic and costs, I am told, more per sheet than most human vessels spend on fuel per parsec. I thanked him, folded the schedule into my document case, and went to find my quarters. The session was not, formally speaking, about humans at all. It concerned a territorial boundary dispute between the Keth Dominion and the Murath Collective, two species with a complicated history involving an old border treaty, several resource-rich systems in contested space, profound mutual conviction that the other side was acting in bad faith. The Compact had been asked to provide a neutral mediation framework. We had been doing this for 6 months in preliminary correspondence. The Veth Eridor session was supposed to be the formal opening of structured arbitration, procedural, administrative, establishing the ground rules and the documentation protocols before any substantive negotiation began. It was not, in other words, a dramatic occasion. It was the meeting before the meetings. I was there to manage the Compact's documentation, to ensure that every procedural record was correctly time-stamped, witnessed, filed in both parties' archival formats, and cross-referenced against the relevant treaty instruments. I was also, technically, the Compact's senior representative in the room, because the Compact's 2 senior mediators were both occupied with a crisis in a different system, and the third most senior mediator had contracted a respiratory infection and had been advised not to travel. I was the 4th most senior. I have, in my 19 years, attended many sessions in this capacity without incident. The documentation is handled correctly. The procedures are followed. The record is complete. I go home. Nobody writes about it. What I did not know when I boarded the Portsmouth 7 for the transit to Veth Eridor was that I had been tracked since departure. I should explain the context, because the record requires it. Roughly for my prior to this session, the Keth Dominion had been attempting channels that were technically legal and practically very irritating. Obtain advance copies of certain IMC archival documents, specifically, a series of binding arbitration instruments from the previous Keth-Murath boundary resolution, which had been filed and sealed under standard compact protocols 40 years earlier. The Keth position, as I understood it from the preliminary correspondence, was that these earlier instruments supported their current territorial claims. Position was that the Keth were misremembering what those instruments said. Neither party had direct access to the originals. The Compact's sealed archives held the authoritative copies. There had been, in the months preceding this session, 2 separate attempts to access those archives through formal petition. Both had been correctly processed and denied on procedural grounds, with a note that the documents could be properly introduced and reviewed under the structured arbitration framework once that framework was established. There had also been, according to a security notice I received 2 weeks before departure, 1 attempt to access the archives through means that were not formal and not procedural. This attempt had not succeeded. The security notice was marked low priority. I had filed it in the correct folder and returned to my work. What I was carrying in my document case, under standard Courier protocols, was the full set of SEAL IMC arbitration instruments relating to all prior Keth-Murath boundary resolutions in authenticated original format, with chain of custody documentation complete to the current date. This was routine. The Compact always brings the relevant instruments to an arbitration session. The instruments travel with the senior representative. The senior representative travels on the IMC Courier vessel. The Portsmouth 7 is, as I mentioned, not a beautiful ship. I have been asked, since, whether I was aware that the Keth would have people watching for the document's arrival. The answer is, I knew it was possible, in the abstract way that one knows many things are possible. I had read the security notice. I had also read the Compact's Courier protocols, which have been in place for 4 decades, and which specify in Section 14, Paragraph 3, that authenticated instruments travel under sealed courier protocols, precisely because there are parties who would prefer to access them before the formal arbitrations framework is established, and that the correct response to this preference is to maintain the protocol and deliver the instruments through the proper channel, which is the session. This is what the protocol is for. I did not think about it much more than that. In the 2 days before the session opened, I occupied myself with preparations. I reviewed my copies of the preliminary correspondence, 6 months of letters, counterproposals, procedural objections, and one extended exchange about whether the session should be held on Veth Arador or at a neutral transit station, which the Keth had eventually won, on the grounds that the relevant treaty instruments specified the host party's jurisdiction for initial arbitration sessions, a clause both parties had apparently forgotten existed until the Keth delegation's legal team rediscovered it. I reread carefully the relevant treaty instruments, paying particular attention to the disputed sections and the surrounding provisions that neither party had cited in correspondence, which is usually where the useful dosage lives. I organized my documentation system, verified my timestamp unit, and tested my portable filing protocol through 3 complete dry runs, because a filing error in a formal session is the kind of thing that gets into the record and then stays there. I also, on the 2nd day, walked to the Portsmouth 7's berth and sat in the main cabin for an hour with a cup of tea, reviewing the chain of custody records. This is not standard preparation procedure. I did it because I find the ship's cabin a reasonable place to think, and because the chain of custody records, which I had verified twice before departure and once since arrival, were correct, and reviewing them a 4th time did not produce any new information. But it settled something. 19 years of this work will give you particular rituals before difficult sessions. I also, while aboard, spoke briefly with our navigator, a woman named Trellish, who has been flying IMC couriers for 12 years, and who regards the Portsmouth 7 with the specific affection that comes from knowing every peculiarity of a vessel and having made peace with them. She mentioned in passing, 2 Keth maintenance drones had made passes near our berth since arrival, closer than the routine maintenance pattern for this ring of station. Trellish had logged them. I thanked her. I noted it, as I note most things. On the 2nd day, I also took a walk through the portions of Veth Arador accessible to visitors. 19 years of this work have taught me that knowing the physical layout of a place is never wasted, because the station was genuinely interesting to look at up close. The engineering sections, visible through observation ports, were impressive in the particular Keth way, substantial, redundant, built to communicate that the structure expects to outlast whatever temporary concerns its occupants bring to it. The administrative wings were quieter, lined with the Keth equivalent of institutional portraiture, formal renderings of past accordants and senior officials, their thoracic plating etched with career designation marks, their compound eyes reflecting the amber light in ways that gave the portraits an odd quality of alertness, even at a distance. I found myself stopping in front of a rendering of an accordant from the early treaty period, late 23rd century by the date mark, which would mean she had served during the original Keth-Mureth boundary negotiations that produced the instruments I was carrying. Her expression, rendered in whatever Keth artistic tradition this was, conveyed something I interpreted as composed authority, the look of someone who understood precisely what the documents in front of her said and was prepared to wait for everyone else to catch up. I found that relatable. I moved on. On the evening before the session, I made tea in my quarters and sat with the 2341 consolidated boundary instrument for 2 hours, making notes. I was not preparing arguments. I would not be making arguments. I was ensuring I understood the document completely, so that when I introduced it and flagged the relevant provisions, I was flagging the right ones, for the right reasons, and my notes in the session record would be accurate. Article 7 took me the better part of 40 minutes. It is a dense piece of drafting, the kind of dense that comes from a drafter who is trying very hard to be precise, which is admirable, and and who was also operating under pressure from two parties with incompatible interests, tends to produce language that serves neither party's preferred reading, but which, if followed correctly, produces a workable procedure. The person who wrote it was, I think, more careful than the people who later read and cited it. Both sides had been reading the article's first two paragraphs, which set out the general principles, and stopping there. The third paragraph specifies how the general principles are applied in cases of contested demarcation, is where the article does its actual work. It is 400 words, and it contains the resolution to the dispute. Both parties had been standing directly in front of it for 4 months, without reading to the end of the page. I flagged the third paragraph, made my notes, and went to sleep. The first formal session opened at the standard hour, in the Veth Arador Primary Arbitration Chamber. The chamber was everything its name suggested. High-vaulted, the walls lined with the Keth architectural equivalent of institutional gravitas, which involves a great deal of dark composite material and amber accent lighting, arranged to make the ceiling look further away than it is. The delegation tables were long, heavy, and made of a material that looked like dark stone, but was almost certainly composite. There were 3 witness alcoves at the rear of the chamber, occupied by a small number of observers from the Keth diplomatic staff, and, I noted, 2 individuals in a different style of Keth official uniform that I did not immediately place but which my assistant later identified as belonging the Dominion's Intelligence Affairs branch. There were 2 long delegation tables, one for each party, short neutral table at the apex of the arrangement, where the Compact's representative sat, where I sat. I had with me my document case, portable filing system, my certified timestamp unit, and my tea, which I had prepared in my quarters and brought in a sealed container, because the Keth, to my knowledge, do not have tea, and I was going to be there for a long morning. The Keth delegation was led by a senior diplomat, whose title translates as something like Senior Accordant of the Second Chamber, and who I will call Accordant Veth Moru. She was tall, even by Keth standards. The articulate plates across her upper thorax were etched with rank designations in a style that I was told indicated at least 30 years of diplomatic service. She moved to her seat with the deliberateness of someone for whom every room has been adequately sized for her entire career. She sat with a composed stillness of someone who has determined the outcome of this meeting in advance and is here to manage the formalities. Delegation arranged itself to her left and right with the quiet precision of long practice. When she looked at me, across the chamber, compound eyes took in the full picture: the compact neutral table, the document case, the portable filing unit, the sealed container of tea. Gaze moved to my assistant, who was a junior archivist named Brent, 24 years old, wearing a slightly rumpled IMC field uniform and looking as Brent usually looks, like he is doing his best, while aware that some of the context has not yet been fully explained to him. Then back to the document case. Then back to me. She said something to her deputy that our translator did not catch in full. The fragment we received was approximately: the compact sends a records clerk. Her deputy made a sound our translator rendered as acknowledged, which I was told afterward was the Keth equivalent of a politely suppressed laugh. The intelligence affairs observers in the alcove showed no reaction, but they were watching the document case. The Murrath delegation, seated across the chamber, showed no visible reaction to any of this. The Murrath are a quieter species, smoother-shelled than the Keth, and in my experience tend to observe proceedings with what I would describe as patient suspicion. Their lead representative, figure I will call Assessor Murrathvel, was watching me with an expression I could not easily read, but which seemed to involve more careful attention than the Keth delegation was giving the situation. I noted it, as I note most things, and continued with my preparations. Open the session by reading the procedural statement, the formal declaration of the arbitration framework, the applicable treaty instruments, the Compact's role as neutral convener, the procedural rules for the conduct of the session. This took approximately 12 minutes. I read it in the standard cadence I have used for 19 years, which is clear and unrushed, and I have been told by more than one person, has the quality of something being filed rather than spoken. I consider this a compliment. When I finished, I asked both delegations to confirm their acceptance of the framework. The Catalogued confirmed, with the ceremonial acknowledgement phrase, delivered in a tone that suggested she was accepting the framework the way one accepts a receipt for a transaction that is already complete. The Murith assessor confirmed, watching me. I then said that before proceeding to preliminary substantive statements, I would be introducing the relevant treaty instruments into the formal record, as required by Compact Arbitration Protocol, and that both delegations would be provided authenticated copies for review, according to the schedule outlined in the procedural statement. The Cathaloged's compound eyes moved to my document case. I opened it. This is the part I want to describe carefully, because the document case is not a dramatic object. It is a standard IMC field case, dark gray, aluminum reinforced, with a biometric seal and a passive tamper detection layer. It is approximately the size of a large briefcase. It was sitting on the neutral table in plain view throughout the entire procedural statement, and nobody in the room had found it worthy of particular attention, until the moment I opened it, at which point both delegations appeared to recalibrate something. I removed the document packaging, 12 sealed envelopes, each containing an authenticated original, each labeled with its filing reference number in the standard format, each with its chain of custody seal intact. I set them in order on the table. Brent positioned himself at the distribution station with the copy sets. I began the formal instrument introduction. Each document was announced by its filing reference, its date, its issuing authority, and its seal classification. Each was logged by my portable filing system and timestamped. I spoke in the same cadence I had used for the procedural statement. I did not slow down and I did not speed up. The instruments I introduced, in order, were the original 2281 Keth Murith Boundary Resolution Agreement, the 2281 Resolutions Attached Survey Instruments, 2299 Supplementary Demarcation Protocol, the 2299 Protocols Correction Addendum, which is a document that I have always privately found interesting because the correction is larger than the original one, and in practice, supersedes most of what it purports to be correcting. The 2314 Interim Access Agreement, and the 2341 Consolidated Boundary Instrument, which is the most recent, most comprehensive, and most directly relevant document in the set, and which contains 3 specific articles that I had reviewed carefully before, because I had read the preliminary correspondence, and I knew what both parties thought those articles said. I had also read the articles themselves. Both parties were, in different ways, wrong about what they said. By the time I had introduced the third instrument, the Cathaloged had stopped making notes on her delegation tablet. She was watching the documents emerge from my case with an attention that had not been present at the start of the session. Deputy was having a quiet, low-voiced exchange with the officer seated beside him. The 2 intelligence affairs observers in the alcove had both leaned forward slightly. I did not look up. I continued introducing instruments. When I placed the 2341 Consolidated Boundary Instrument on the table and read its filing reference, the chamber was very quiet. I said, "This document carries original seal classification, Omega Archival. Chain of custody unbroken. Last held under compact secure transit from the Central Archive of the Interstellar Mediation Compact, received by this session under standard authenticated courier protocols." I said it in the same tone I say everything, because that is the professional standard, and because it is also in this kind of situation the most effective approach available. Then I looked up. The Cathaloged was looking at the document, then at me, then at the document. I said, "Both delegations will receive authenticated copies for review prior to the substantive session, as outlined in the schedule." Accordant Veth Maru said, in a voice that was precisely calibrated and gave away almost nothing, "These instruments were held in the Compact's sealed archive." I said, "Yes," she said. "They were sealed pending establishment of the arbitration framework." I said, "They were. The framework has now been established. This is the first session of structured arbitration. The introduction of the relevant instruments is the next item on the procedural agenda. It is on the schedule you received." There was a pause. She said, "The schedule we received did not specify the scope of the document set," I said. "The schedule listed, Introduction of Relevant Treaty Instruments, Per compact arbitration protocol, the relevant treaty instruments for a Keth-Morath boundary arbitration are these instruments. They are the instruments on record. They are the ones I was asked to bring. Another pause, longer. The deputy was now speaking quietly but with some urgency to a second aide, who rose and left the chamber through the side door. I noted this. I continued to be seated. I picked up my tea, had cooled to a drinkable temperature, and had some. I should note, for the record, what the Keth Accordant did not do. She did not raise her voice. She did not challenge the instrument's authenticity. She could see the seals, and she understood chain of custody documentation, and she knew that challenging them on authenticity grounds would fail and would also be logged as procedural objection, which would become part of the formal record in a way that would not be useful for her delegation. She did not ask me to delay the introduction. There were no procedural grounds for such a request at this stage in the session. She was an experienced diplomat with 30 years of service. She understood exactly what was in front of her, which was P. The documents delegation had spent 4 months trying to access outside this channel, now sitting on the table in the correct channel, in authenticated original form, available to both parties equally. She had been outmaneuvered by a protocol document and a 40-year-old courier ship. I do not imagine this had happened to her before. Assessor Murathvel, across the chamber, had not left the chamber during the pause. She was still seated, reviewing her own materials with a careful attention that I thought was perhaps the most professionally composed reaction in the room. After a moment, she looked across at me, and I returned the look, and I could see her working through the same understanding. The Keth delegation was working through, and arriving somewhere different, because her delegation was not the one that had been trying to intercept these documents for 4 months. I said, addressing both delegations, I would also note for the record that Article 7 of the 2341 Consolidated Boundary Instrument contains a provision regarding the mediation authority, right to interpret ambiguous demarcation language, and specifically a procedure in paragraph 3 of that article for handling cases where the existing boundary language is contested by both parties. This provision may be relevant to both parties' preliminary statements. I have flagged it in the authenticated copies. The Keth Accordant said, the Keth Dominion is familiar with Article 7, I said. Both delegations will have 10 days to review the instruments in full for the first substantive session. Paragraph 3 of Article 7 is approximately 400 words. It is on page 31 of the 2341 instrument, beginning with the phrase, in cases where existing demarcation records are held by neither party in authenticated original form. I mention it because I thought it might save time. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed this. The aide who had left the chamber returned and handed the Keth deputy a message. The deputy read it. His thoracic plates made a very slight adjustment that our translator later described as registered. He passed the message to Accordant Veth Moru. She read it. Her plates were entirely still. The message was, as I had expected, from their Intelligence Affairs Office, which had completed a more thorough scan of the Portsmouth Sevens manifest during the session, and had now identified the document packages correctly. I do not know exactly what the message said. I know what it would have needed to say, and the Accordant's expression after reading it told me it said approximately that. She looked at me. I said, shall I proceed with the copy distribution schedule, or does the Keth delegation require a brief recess? She said, after a moment. A brief recess would be appropriate, I said. Certainly, shall we say 20 minutes? She said, yes, I said. I will note the recess in the session record. We will resume at the scheduled time. She stood, which for a Keth of her rank is a formal signal to the rest of the delegation to also stand. And they left the chamber in a manner that I will describe as organized and purposeful, which is different from unhurried. Brent leaned toward me during the recess and said, very quietly, what just happened? I said. The message was from their Intelligence Affairs Office. They ran a proper scan of the Portsmouth 7 during the session and identified what the document packages actually are. They now know we have the originals. They also know we have read them, because I just told them which article to look at and where to find the relevant paragraph. Brent said, did you know that would happen? The scan, I mean. I said I knew it was possible. Their intelligence affairs people would have had the manifest flagged as a low-priority item since our arrival. A courier ship carrying encrypted document packages from the IMC is not unusual. It would take a triggered re-examination to identify the packages correctly, and the trigger would be seeing the documents come out of the case in a formal session. So, yes, in the sense that I knew the sequence of events that would produce that outcome. He thought about this for a moment. I had my tea. The Murath assessor had not left the chamber. She was seated at her delegation table, reviewing something in her files. After a moment, she looked across at me, and I looked at her, and she said, in a tone that carried the first genuine curiosity I had heard from anyone in the room, "You came on that ship, Berth 91 Omicron," I said. "Yes," she said. "We have been attempting to obtain access to those instruments for 4 months. Through the proper channels," I said. "I'm aware. Both petitions were correctly processed and denied on procedural grounds. The instruments are introduced under the arbitration framework as required. That's the protocol." She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the documents on the table, arranged in their numbered sequence. Then back at me and said, "And this was always the plan. The instruments travel with the representative on the courier to the session." "It has always been this way," I said. "For 40 years, yes. It's in Section 14 of the Courier Protocols, available to anyone who reads the documentation." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The ship," I said. "It gets us where we need to go." She made a sound our translator later rendered as noted, though I think the translation misses something. It had the quality and context who has just recalibrated their assessment of him, something they had initially filed as unimportant. The Keth delegation returned at the 20-minute mark, which I appreciated. Punctuality, in my experience, is how experienced negotiators signal that they intend to continue conducting themselves professionally, even after absorbing an unwelcome development. Accordant Vethmoru resumed her seat. Her plates were even. She looked, if I am being precise about it, like someone who has processed a surprise, filed it appropriately, and elected to move forward, she said. "The Keth Dominion is prepared to proceed." I said, "Very good, let's continue." We resumed. The authenticated copies were distributed, a process that took 11 minutes, because the distribution had to be done by document, in order, with each copy formally acknowledged. The review schedule was confirmed. The session record was updated to note the recess, its duration, and the return of both delegations. The preliminary procedural items that remained were completed. The session record was time-stamped and witnessed. Everything was done correctly. We adjourned at the standard hour, and Brent and I walked back through the long corridor from the chamber to the transit system, and from the transit system back to the outer ring, and from the outer ring back to Berth 91 Omicron and the Portsmouth 7. The ship was exactly as we had left it. The hull was the same patched, mismatched gray. The port coupling made it sound. The berth was still across from the maintenance staging area, and it was still not particularly well lit, and nobody had come to upgrade it during our absence. I went to my quarters, refiled the session documentation, dated the chain of Cuddy records for all 12 instruments, made a fresh container of tea, and sat down to review Article 7 one more time, specifically paragraph 3, to verify that the language I had quoted from memory in the chamber was accurate. It was accurate. 2 days later, in the first substantive session, both delegations presented preliminary statements. The Keth statement referenced Article 7, in full, including paragraph 3. So did the Murath statement. Both delegations had read the article over the review period. Both had noted what it actually said, which was different from what either had previously believed its saw. The negotiation that followed was long, 3 weeks, and I will not describe all of it, as most of it is in the formal record, and the formal record does not need my editorial additions. There were difficult days and less difficult days. There were sessions where both parties' positions seemed irreconcilable, and sessions where the gap between them was narrower than either side was prepared to acknowledge in the room, which was visible in the documentation if you tracked the movement of their stated positions across sessions, which I did, because I track things for a living. There were procedural disputes. There were documentation disputes. There was one afternoon when both delegations disagreed about the correct interpretation of a survey coordinate. In the 2281 instruments, I produced the original, the actual original, not a copy, and read the coordinate aloud, twice, clearly, and the disagreement ended. There was one occasion when the CNE delegation formally objected to the timestamp format I was using, which was resolved by referring to the relevant section of the Compact's arbitration protocol, which I had with me, because I have learned to travel with the full protocol documentation. The objection was withdrawn. The timestamp format was the correct one. On the 9th day, the accordance deputy approached me during an adjournment and asked, in the careful way of someone raising a subject they have decided to raise cautiously, whether the Compact had any additional instruments relating to the 2281 survey, specifically, whether there were field notes or preliminary survey records that predated the formal instruments. I said, there are preliminary records in the Compact's archive. They are not binding instruments. They can be introduced into the record as supporting documentation if both parties agree to their introduction, and if the request is submitted through the proper procedural channel, which is a written request filed before the start of a session, he said. And if such a request were submitted, I said, it would be processed according to the protocol. If the records are relevant, they would be produced at the session following receipt of the request. He thanked me. He filed the request before the start of the next session. The records were produced. They were, as it turned out, useful to both parties, and the Murath delegation also filed a records request 2 days later, which was handled in the same way. This is, I should note, entirely routine. The protocol provides for it. Delegations had the same access to the same process. The process works when people use it. What I will say is that the negotiation concluded in a settlement framework that both parties accepted, built on the survey evidence review process that Article 7 had always provided for, and that this process had not been accessible to either party for the preceding 4 months, because neither of them had the originals of the instruments that established it. Having the originals in the room, properly introduced, in authenticated form, on the first day of the session, meant that the thing the dispute had been circling around for months was on the table from the beginning. This is, in my view, why Courier protocols exist. On the last day of the session, as the final documents were being signed and witnessed and timestamped and filed, Accordant Veth Maru looked across the chamber at me and said, in a tone that was entirely level and gave away almost nothing, Compact's Courier protocols are more thorough than I had appreciated, I said. They've been in place for 40 years. We find they work. She looked at me for a moment. Then she made the slight inclination that in Keth formal context indicates acknowledgement of a point well taken. It is a small gesture, and performed with the minimal motion characteristic of her rank, and I do not think she intended it to be particularly visible. But I have been in these rooms for 19 years, and I notice small gestures. I thanked her delegation for the hospitality of the station. I thanked the Murath delegation for their participation. I packed my document case, 12 instruments, all properly resealed and returned to Courier protocol, chain of custody updated to reflect their release from session, and returned to transit. I collected Brent, who had been finishing the copy distribution confirmations, and had developed, over 3 weeks, particular expression of someone who arrived not entirely understanding what they were part of, and is leaving with a different relationship to paperwork. We walked back to berth 91 Omicron. The Portsmouth 7 was exactly as we had left it. The hull still looked like a corrected document. Port coupling made it sound. The docking clamps released with the standard sequence, and we filed our departure manifest with the docking authority. The notation the authority made, which I also saw in the communication logs during the later documentation review, read, IMC Courier, routine departure, no notable incidents. I found that accurate. We cleared the station and set course for home. I finished my tea. Brent sat in the co-pilot's seat for a while, without saying anything, watching the station diminish behind us, through the observation port. Those amber litons growing smaller, the docking bays that could fit destroyers receding until they were just points of light against the homeworld below. Then, Then he said, next time we dock somewhere like that, do you think they'll assign us a better berth? I thought about it. Berth 91 Omicron. Manual docking clamps. Coolant smell. The maintenance staging area across the corridor. 2 Ketheth intelligence drones making slow passes over the hull, checking the manifest of a ship that looked like it had been repaired with the wrong color pen. I said, probably not. He nodded. Like that was a reasonable answer. It was a reasonable answer. The ship looks like what it looks like. Shh. Nobody is going to change the berth assignment based on the manifest, and we don't need them to. Protocol does not depend on anyone understanding what we're carrying. The protocol depends on delivering what we're carrying to the session, through the correct channel, at the correct time. Everything else follows from that. Portsmouth 7 made its small sound as the port coupling settled into transit configuration. The hull was the same patched, mismatched gray it had always been. It would look the same at the next station and the one after that. We know what we're carrying. That has always been enough.